receives the strongest presumption of validity.
I just don't understand this argument. It's not an article. It's a congressional power, not a presidential power to tax. And you want to say tariffs are not taxes, but that's exactly what they are. They're generating money from American citizens, revenue. And you say it's incidental to the regulatory purpose. But I don't see how a quota is equivalent to revenue raising. A quota sets a limit to what you can import in, but it doesn't generate revenue. I don't understand this argument, that it's equivalent, or that foreign powers or even an emergency can do away with the major questions doctrine. Didn't we in the Biden case recently say an emergency can't make clear what's ambiguous?
As to that point, I believe the court has never applied the major questions doctrine in the foreign policy context.
But we have,
emergency context, not the foreign policy context.
We have never applied it to foreign affairs, but this is a tariff. This is a tax.
Okay, so the Supreme Court just dropped a bomb that could send Donald Trump to prison. Yeah, you heard that right. Prison. The highest court in America, including 3 justices that Trump himself appointed, just told him in the most brutal way possible that he's not above the law. On November 3rd, 2025, the Supreme Court denied Trump's emergency request to stop his sentencing for 34 felony convictions, 34 felonies. And when they denied that request, they didn't just say no. They made it crystal clear that Trump is a convicted criminal and that conviction is going to follow him for the rest of his life. Those aren't my words. That's literally what legal analysts are saying the court established. Trump tried every legal trick in the book to avoid this moment. He claimed presidential immunity. He argued he was president-elect and therefore untouchable. He said the timing was political persecution. The Supreme Court looked at all of that and said, nope, you're going to sentencing and there's nothing you can do about it. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust headlines anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
It is a, if I may, it's a foreign-facing regulation of foreign commerce. That's a regulatory tariff distinct from a tax.
So Biden could have declared a national emergency in global warming and then gotten his student forgiveness to not be a major questions doctrine?
I don't think he could have gotten student loan forgiveness.
Why?
But
it's global. It's foreign-facing. We need all of these things to face to tax fossil fuel or to do something else. That's all Biden would have had to do with any of his programs.
Let me put it this way, if I may.
Is just declare some foreign-facing purpose?
If I may, maybe I can articulate it this way. The power to impose tariffs is a core application of the power to regulate foreign commerce, which is what the phrase regulate importation in IEPA naturally evokes.
Why
not the power to tax.
Could you tell me why it is that when Congress intended...
Can you believe this? We're talking about a sitting president in his second term who's now officially a convicted felon with sentencing happening imminently. This isn't some pending case that might go away. This isn't charges that could be dismissed. This is done. The conviction stands. Trump is a felon, period. And the Supreme Court just removed the last legal barrier that was protecting him from facing the consequences. Think about what this means. Trump has been fighting these charges for years, claiming that as a former president and now current president, he has immunity from prosecution. His entire legal strategy has been based on the idea that the presidency puts you above the law, that you can't be held criminally accountable for actions you took while in office or even before taking office if you're a president or president-elect. The Supreme Court just demolished that argument completely. They said, no, presidential immunity doesn't work that way, and you're going to face justice like any other American citizen. And here's the thing that makes this absolutely devastating for Trump. This decision doesn't just affect the New York hush money case. This opens the floodgates for every other criminal prosecution he's facing. The federal cases about classified documents, the Georgia election interference case, all the other state and federal investigations that have been waiting in the wings. They were all watching to see if the Supreme Court would give Trump some kind of blanket immunity that would shut down prosecutions across the board. The court didn't just say no to that. They established legal precedent that Trump can be prosecuted for private criminal acts even if he was president when those acts occur. That's a game changer. That means prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions are now free to move forward with cases that could result in serious prison time. We're not talking about probation or community service. We're talking about mandatory minimum sentences for some of these charges. Legal experts are saying this could be the most significant Supreme Court decision about presidential accountability in American history. Why? Because it settles, once and for all, the question of whether a president is above the law. The answer is no. Definitively, unambiguously, no. A president can commit crimes, a president can be prosecuted for those crimes, a president can be convicted, and a president can go to prison. That's the precedent that's now been set, and Trump is the test case for all of it. He's the first president to be criminally convicted, and depending on how his sentencing goes, he could be the first president to actually serve prison time. Think about how insane that is. We could have a president running the country from a jail cell or stepping down because he's behind bars. That's not some wild hypothetical anymore. That's a real possibility that the Supreme Court just made viable. Come on, you know Trump's losing his mind over this, right? His whole brand, his whole political identity is built on being the guy who wins, who beats the system, who never backs down. And now the Supreme Court, with justices he put on the bench himself, just handed him the most humiliating legal defeat of his entire career. Justice Neil Gorsuch, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, all three of them Trump appointees, and they all went along with this decision. They could have sided with Trump. They could have found some technical reason to delay or block the sentencing, but they didn't. They let it proceed. That tells you everything about how weak Trump's legal arguments were. Even the justices who supposedly owe their careers to him couldn't find a legal justification to save him, and the timing is crucial here. We're heading into the heart of Trump's second term. His approval ratings are already shaky because of all the other controversies, the court battles, the constitutional showdowns with judges. Now you add convicted felon to his list of problems. How does that play with moderate voters? How does that affect his ability to govern when he's facing sentencing and potentially prison time? The political implications are staggering. Democrats are going to hammer this nonstop. Every campaign ad, every debate, every news cycle is going to feature the fact that the sitting president is a convicted criminal. Republicans are going to have to decide whether they're willing to defend a felon or whether they finally break with Trump to save their own political futures. This decision from the Supreme Court isn't just a legal earthquake, it's a political nuclear bomb that's going to reshape American politics for years to come. Let's break down exactly what happened, what the legal reasoning was, and what comes next for Trump. All right, so let's dig into the details of this Supreme Court decision because the legal reasoning here is absolutely critical to understanding why this is such a massive deal. First, we need to talk about what Trump was actually convicted of. The New York hush money case involved 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. The charges stem from payments Trump made to adult film actress Stormy Daniels during the 2016 election to keep her quiet about an alleged affair. Trump's organization recorded these payments as legal expenses when they were actually hush money payments designed to influence the election. That's a crime in New York. Falsifying business records becomes a felony when it's done to cover up another crime, in this case campaign finance violations. A jury heard all the evidence, deliberated, and found Trump guilty on all 34 counts. That conviction happened months ago, but Trump's been fighting to delay sentencing ever since, using every legal maneuver available. His main argument has been presidential immunity. Trump claimed that because he was president when some of the relevant conduct occurred, and because he's currently serving as president again in his second term, he should be immune from criminal prosecution. He pointed to a Supreme Court decision from July 2024 called Trump versus United States, where the court ruled that presidents do have some immunity for official acts taken while in office. Trump's lawyers tried to stretch that ruling to cover everything, arguing that basically anything a president does is an official act and therefore immune from prosecution. But the Supreme Court in that July 2024 decision was actually pretty clear about the limits of immunity. They said presidents have immunity for core constitutional duties and official acts, but not for private conduct. The hush money payments to Stormy Daniels, those weren't official presidential acts. Those were private actions taken by private citizen Donald Trump to cover up a personal scandal and influence an election, totally outside the scope of official presidential duties. So when Trump filed his emergency request to the Supreme Court, asking them to block his sentencing, he was essentially asking them to expand the immunity doctrine way beyond what they'd already established. He was saying, look, I'm the president. You can't sentence me while I'm in office because it would interfere with my ability to govern. The Supreme Court looked at that argument and rejected it completely. They didn't even grant a hearing or ask for full briefing. They just denied the request outright. That's how weak they thought Trump's legal position was, and the message that sends is devastating for Trump's other legal cases. It means the Supreme Court is not going to bail him out by creating some kind of super immunity that shields presidents from all criminal accountability. It means that the distinction between official acts and private conduct actually matters and will be enforced by courts. It means Trump is going to have to face the music in multiple jurisdictions for multiple alleged crimes. Now let's talk about what the Supreme Court actually said in their July 2024 Trump versus United States decision, because that's the legal foundation for everything happening now. In that case, the court was dealing with the federal January 6 prosecution, where Trump was charged with conspiracy to overturn the 2020 election results. Trump argued he had absolute immunity for everything he did as president. The Supreme Court said no, immunity is not absolute, but it does exist for certain categories of presidential action. They created a framework where presidents have absolute immunity for core constitutional powers, like commanding the military or granting pardons. They have presumptive immunity for other official acts, meaning prosecutors would have to overcome a high bar to charge those acts, and they have no immunity at all for unofficial or private acts. The court sent the case back to the trial judge to sort out which of Trump's actions fell into which category. But the key takeaway was that private conduct gets no immunity protection whatsoever. That ruling opened the door for the New York prosecution to move forward because the hush money payments were clearly private conduct. They happened before Trump was even president. They involved his personal life, his personal money, his private business dealings. There's no plausible argument that paying off a porn star to hide an affair is an official presidential duty. So the immunity defense was never going to work for the New York case, and the Supreme Court's refusal to intervene in the sentencing confirms that. But here's why this matters beyond just the New York case. Trump is facing charges in multiple other jurisdictions that also involve private or unofficial conduct. The Georgia case about election interference involves phone calls Trump made trying to pressure state officials to overturn election results. Those weren't official presidential acts. Those were campaign-related actions to benefit Trump personally. The classified documents case involves Trump taking government records to his private residence and refusing to return them. Again, not official conduct, that's personal behavior that happened after he left office. All of these cases were waiting to see how the Supreme Court would handle presidential immunity. Would they create a broad shield that protected former presidents from most prosecutions? Would they give deference to claims of immunity, even for questionable conduct? The answer is no on both counts. The court has made it clear that immunity is narrow, that it only applies to official acts, and that former presidents can and will be held accountable for crimes. That's a green light for prosecutors everywhere who have cases against Trump, and it means Trump could be facing multiple trials, multiple convictions, and potentially multiple prison sentences, all stemming from conduct that the Supreme Court has now confirmed is not protected by any form of immunity. Legal analysts are pointing out that some of these cases carry mandatory minimum sentences. That means if Trump is convicted, the judge has no choice but to impose at least a minimum amount of prison time, no probation, no suspended sentence, actual incarceration. For example, some of the charges in the classified documents case carry mandatory minimums of several years. If Trump gets convicted on multiple counts, those sentences could stack, meaning he could be looking at decades in prison. Now, obviously, Trump will appeal everything, and these cases could drag on for years, but the Supreme Court's decision removes the main legal shield he was counting on. He can't claim immunity anymore. He can't argue that being president makes him untouchable. He's going to have to defend these cases on the actual facts and the actual law, and that's a much harder fight. Are you kidding me? The guy appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, and those same justices are now letting him be prosecuted and sentenced as a felon. That's got to sting. Trump spent his entire first term reshaping the federal judiciary, putting conservative judges on courts all across the country, specifically so he'd have friendly judges if he ever faced legal trouble, and it didn't work. The Supreme Court, even with a 6-3 conservative majority, isn't willing to twist the law to protect him. They're following legal precedent and constitutional principles, even when it means ruling against the president who appointed some of them. That's actually how the system is supposed to work, but it's got to be shocking for Trump, who assumed loyalty from his appointees. The political fallout from this is going to be enormous. Trump's base is going to see this as more proof of a rigged system, of establishment judges betraying Trump even after he put them on the bench. They're going to argue that the prosecutions are politically motivated, that the charges are trumped up, that this is all about stopping Trump from implementing his agenda. And look, there's definitely a political dimension to all of this. The timing of these prosecutions, the jurisdictions bringing them, the way they're being covered by media, all of that has political elements. But the Supreme Court's decision makes it clear that whatever the politics might be, the legal basis for prosecuting Trump is sound. You can't just wave away 34 felony convictions because you don't like the political implications. Come on. Think about what this means for future presidents. Every president from here on out is going to know that they can be prosecuted for crimes after leaving office. They can't hide behind immunity for private conduct. They can't claim that being president puts them above the law. That's a good thing for accountability and for democracy, but it also changes the calculus for anyone considering running for president. You're going to be under intense scrutiny, your past actions are going to be investigated, and if you break the law, you're going to face consequences. Okay, so let's break down what this actually means for Trump's immediate future and for American politics more broadly. First, the sentencing in the New York case. This is happening soon, like potentially within days or weeks now that the Supreme Court has cleared the way. The judge in the case, Judge Juan Merchan, has to decide what punishment fits 34 felony convictions for falsifying business records. In New York, each count of falsifying business records in the first degree carries a maximum sentence of 4 years in prison. Trump was convicted on 34 counts, so theoretically, he could face over 100 years in prison if the sentences ran consecutively. That's obviously not going to happen. Judges almost never impose the maximum sentence, especially for first-time offenders, which Trump technically is in terms of criminal convictions. But the judge does have a range of options. He could impose probation, which would mean Trump stays out of prison, but has to check in with a probation officer and follow certain conditions. He could impose a fine, which for someone of Trump's wealth might not be much of a deterrent. Or he could impose actual jail time, which could range from a few months to several years, depending on how seriously the judge views the crimes. Legal experts are divided on what's most likely. Some think the judge will be lenient because Trump is a former and current president and because incarceration would create massive logistical and constitutional problems. How do you put a sitting president in jail? Does the Secret Service guard him in prison? Can he still perform presidential duties from a cell? These are questions nobody wants to deal with. But other legal experts think the judge might impose jail time precisely because Trump is the president and needs to be held to a higher standard of accountability. The argument would be that if anyone should face the full consequences of breaking the law, it's the person who's supposed to be the chief law enforcement officer of the nation. Judge Merchan has given some hints about his thinking. He's made comments during the trial about the seriousness of the charges and about Trump's lack of remorse. Trump has never admitted wrongdoing, never apologized, and has continued to attack the judge, the prosecutors, and the entire legal system throughout the trial. That lack of remorse could factor into a harsher sentence. But here's where things get really complicated. Even if Judge Merchan imposes jail time, Trump is almost certainly not going to prison immediately. He'll appeal the sentence, and during the appeals process, he'll likely be allowed to remain free on bail. That appeals process could take years to wind through the New York court system. So we could have this bizarre situation where Trump is the sitting president with a prison sentence hanging over his head, knowing that once all his appeals are exhausted, he might have to report to jail. Can you imagine the political chaos that would create? Trump would be governing under the threat of imminent incarceration. His opponents will be counting down the days until he has to surrender, and his supporters would be demanding that he pardon himself or that Congress intervene somehow to prevent the sentence from being carried out. And that brings up the question of whether Trump can pardon himself for these state charges. The answer is no. Presidential pardon power only applies to federal crimes. The New York hush money case is a state prosecution brought under New York state law. Trump as president has no authority to pardon state crimes. Only the governor of New York could issue a pardon, and the current New York governor is a Democrat who's been very critical of Trump, so there's zero chance of a state pardon happening. Trump is stuck with this conviction unless he can get it overturned on appeal, and given that the Supreme Court just refused to intervene, his chances of success on appeal don't look great. Now let's talk about the other cases Trump is facing and how this Supreme Court decision affects them. The federal classified documents case is probably the most serious in terms of potential prison time. Trump is charged with willfully retaining national defense information, obstructing justice, and making false statements to investigators. These are serious federal crimes, some of which carry mandatory minimum sentences. The case has been moving slowly through the courts, partly because Trump has been filing motion after motion, trying to get the charges dismissed based on presidential immunity. Well, the Supreme Court just signaled that immunity defense isn't going to work for this case either. The charges relate to conduct after Trump left office, when he allegedly took classified documents to Mar-a-Lago and refused to return them, despite multiple requests from the National Archives and the Justice Department. None of that conduct was part of Trump's official presidential duties, so there's no immunity protection. The Georgia election interference case is another big one. Trump and multiple co-defendants are charged with conspiracy to overturn the 2020 election results in Georgia. The charges include making false statements to state officials, soliciting election fraud, and participating in a racketeering scheme. Again, these charges relate to Trump's private conduct as a candidate trying to win an election, not his official acts as president. The Supreme Court's immunity ruling doesn't protect him here. This case has been moving even slower than the federal case because of issues with the prosecutor and various defense motions, but now that the immunity question is settled, expect it to pick up speed. And Georgia state charges, like New York state charges, can't be pardoned by the president. If Trump gets convicted in Georgia, he's stuck with that conviction too. The political implications of all this are staggering. Trump's opponents are going to use his felon status against him relentlessly. Every speech, Every ad, every debate is going to feature the fact that he's a convicted criminal. Democrats are going to argue that the American people deserve better than a president who's facing multiple criminal trials and potential prison sentences. They're going to say that Trump can't effectively govern when he's spending half his time dealing with legal problems and the other half attacking judges and prosecutors. And honestly, they have a point. How can Trump focus on policy, on foreign relations, on the economy, when he's constantly dealing with court hearings and sentencing dates and appeals? The legal troubles are a massive distraction from governance, and that affects everyone regardless of political affiliation. Republicans are in a really tough spot here. Do they continue to support Trump and defend him as the victim of political persecution? Or do they start to distance themselves and look for alternative leaders who aren't facing criminal prosecution? Some Republicans have stuck with Trump through everything, arguing that the prosecutions are politically motivated and that Trump is being unfairly targeted. But there are limits to how long that argument can hold up, especially now that the Supreme Court, with 3 Trump appointees, has validated the prosecutions by refusing to grant immunity. At some point, defending a convicted felon becomes a political liability that outweighs whatever benefits come from staying loyal to Trump. Can you believe this is where we are as a country? We've got a sitting president who's a convicted felon facing multiple other criminal trials, with the Supreme Court basically saying he's not above the law and he needs to face the consequences of his actions. This is unprecedented in American history. We've had presidents involved in scandals before. We've had presidents resign in disgrace, but we've never had a president who's an actual convicted criminal facing the possibility of prison. And the fact that it's happening during Trump's second term, when he's supposed to be implementing his agenda and leading the country, makes it even more chaotic. The next few months are going to be absolutely critical. Trump's sentencing will set the tone for everything that follows. If he gets probation, his supporters will claim victory and say the whole thing was overblown. If he gets jail time, it's going to trigger a constitutional crisis about whether a sitting president can be in prison and how that would even work. And regardless of the sentence, the other criminal cases are going to keep moving forward. Prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions now have the green light from the Supreme Court to proceed with prosecutions that could result in additional convictions and additional sentences. One more thing to consider is the long-term impact on the presidency as an institution. This Supreme Court decision establishes that presidents are not kings, that they don't have unlimited immunity, and that they can be held criminally accountable for their actions. That's a good thing for democracy and for the rule of law, but it also changes the nature of the presidency in ways we're only beginning to understand. Future presidents are going to be much more cautious about their conduct, knowing that they could face prosecution after leaving office. That might lead to more ethical behavior, or it might lead to presidents being paralyzed by fear of legal consequences for necessary but controversial decisions. It's going to take years or even decades to fully understand how these Trump prosecutions reshape the American presidency. So yeah, this Supreme Court decision is massive. It's not just about Trump, though obviously he's the immediate focus. It's about establishing once and for all that no one in America is above the law, not even the president. It's about holding powerful people accountable for crimes. It's about preserving the rule of law, even when it's politically messy and constitutionally complicated. Trump is going to fight this every step of the way. He's going to appeal. He's going to attack judges and prosecutors. He's going to claim he's being persecuted. But the Supreme Court has spoken, and their message is clear. You're a convicted felon, and that conviction is permanent. Now you have to face the consequences. Stay tuned because the sentencing is coming soon, and whatever happens next is going to be absolutely historic.